I see we have some people coming in. And what I would like to, I need a little help. I want to make sure the audio is okay. So if you could hear me all right, please make a note in the chat box so that you can tell me if the audio is good. I am experiencing a few temporary delays here, I think, as well. We'll let some more people come in. Let me know if you can hear me okay. Welcome, everyone. I'm going to go over live on YouTube, and then we'll get started. Hello, 954 area code, Brenda, Justin, Sheila, Shirley. Welcome, everyone. Give me a moment while I go live on YouTube as some more people come in. One moment. Hope everyone's doing well. And give me a second. Hopefully you can see me all right and that the audio is okay. If you could just type into the chat box if you're hearing me okay, that would be great. Some more people coming in. Hey, Helen, nice to see you. Hey, Lisa, welcome. Okay, one moment. Sound is good. All right, Sheila, that's great. I think there's a little delay. Give me a moment while I go live on YouTube, and then we will get started. Thanks, Justin. Appreciate the feedback there. And it looks like I'm not going to be able to go live on YouTube, which is okay. No problem. I will upload afterwards. So tonight is episode 79, and I'm very excited about this one because a couple of weeks ago, we spoke a little bit about stress, and we spoke about how in stress in general, it's bad, but that there are certain types of stressors that are actually beneficial for your health. And we spoke about two in general. We spoke about exercise, of course. Exercise is a form of stress. I mean, you are breaking down muscle and a whole host of other things. You're going to see that the benefits of exercise go across different parts of the body, not just in the cardiovascular system and the musculoskeletal system, but also other parts. And you're going to see this concept that a little bit of stress, the proper amount, the dose that you need to find is often beneficial for you in ways that you actually never possibly imagined. And this crosses a whole host of things, from environmental toxins to foods and to a riddle that is essentially, why is it that fruits and vegetables are beneficial? And we tend to think that, well, it's, you know, antioxidants and that sort of thing. But actually, a lot of the benefit of fruits and vegetables happens as a result of a toxic-like response. And we're going to be discussing that as well. Today, I'm actually in a conference room in the building where I have my office. And as you can see, the background is kind of cool. They have all kinds of art books in here, and sometimes I come down here and just flip through some of the art books. It's a really cool room. Anyway, so let's get started, and let me share my screen, and we will, let's share my screen. And what you should see on the screen is the word hormesis. Now, hormesis is the scientific term for this notion of beneficial stressors. And you're going to understand this term a lot better. Let me blow up my screen a little bit. And as always, if you have any questions or comments, type them into the chat box. We have a bunch more people that came in. Welcome, everyone. And I think we have enough people to get started. So let's go ahead. For people who are interested, the references for tonight's class are from these three references. I'll post them underneath the YouTube video, which I will upload later, so that if anyone's interested in doing further reading, they can go there. All right, so let's start by talking about how we're going to define the word hormesis and this idea of beneficial stressors. Again, we spoke in detail about how terrible stress is, generally speaking. So we spoke about toxins as well. What you're going to find is that the picture is a lot more complicated than you could ever imagine. And it's really an interesting story, and I really hope you find it as interesting as I did. Now, it started in the field of toxicology, and it was developed as a result of what we call a biphasic dose response, which basically means two responses. And those two responses were basically a low dose benefit. In other words, giving something at a very low dose showed a beneficial effect, but that a very high dose was actually toxic. And therefore, this definition came about, which is a process in which exposure to a low dose of a chemical agent or environmental factor that is damaging at higher doses induces an adaptive beneficial effect on the cell or organism, which of course could be simplified by saying a process in which exposure to a low dose of something that is damaging at higher doses at a low dose is basically beneficial. And by the end of tonight's class, you'll understand why this is such a radical idea. And the history of it is really interesting, because while the general notion of, what doesn't kill us makes us stronger, that sort of famous quote, wasn't completely intuitive in a scientific realm. And in fact, when this concept was introduced, the person who introduced it was actually ridiculed. And this was back in the 1800s. And actually, it wasn't until the 70s and more likely in the 1990s that we really started to get genuine confirmation and acceptance in the scientific community that this was actually even happening. But even back with Paracelsus, who was a Swiss doctor, spoke about how all things are poison and nothing is without poison. Only the dose permits something not to be poison. So in other words, we can talk about anything, really. I mean, anything can be toxic at a certain dose. A toxic dose, you can drink too much water. Believe it or not, there is a situation where you could drink so much water. Of course, this is something that is incredibly rare, but you could take so much water that could dilute your electrolytes, which could then affect your heart, and you could have a problem with your heart and die. Obviously, that's an extreme example of something that obviously you would have to go crazy toxic to have an effect. What we're talking about tonight is how these very low doses can actually have this incredibly beneficial effect overall on your health. Now, why is it? Why would evolution favor a situation where something is at a lower dose beneficial, but yet at a high dose is toxic? And to understand that, you have to understand that over time, organisms and biology evolved in such a way that, as an example, one of the ways they discuss this is things like copper and iron, of course, can be very, very toxic. These are heavy metals, and as a result, they can cause a lot of damage. But over time, organisms realized that if they were able to get to a point where they were able to tolerate a certain amount, other types of biological processes developed that were beneficial, that utilized those same toxins. Giving the example of iron and copper, which are, again, both toxic heavy metals at a certain level, over time, the organism developed this tolerance at a lower dose, and then formed, in other words, adaptive and other types of biological processes that actually made it more likely for them to survive using lower doses, using those lower doses of copper and iron that didn't kill them. And so that's how this developed from a situation where biology found a way. It found a way to utilize things. And this sort of concept has been duplicated over and over again. And of course, you're going to see that in some very interesting examples. So as an example of this sort of thing, which I found sort of interesting, insects treated with low doses of pesticide live longer and produce more eggs. Smaller doses of dioxin, which is of course a very toxic toxin, can actually stimulate some beneficial responses. Now, of course, you don't want to have any exposure to dioxin, but when you study it at an incredibly low level, you can start to see some of these things, which is, an indicator of this idea of hormesis. And actually, there's some benefits to low dose radiation. And I was actually introduced to this concept many years ago. One of my first trips to Japan, I went to a spa in a town called Arima, which is in the Kansai area region of Japan. And yeah, I went to a hot spring called an onsen, and it was amazing overall, just because the onsen was incredible and beautiful. But they had one bath that had this red iron water, and they said that it was actually radioactive. And in one of the information things that they actually had, they said at the that this very, very low dose of radiation is actually beneficial. And they explained the concept at the spa of hormesis. And they had some information about how they did these studies where they shielded radiation, because of course we're getting a little bit of radiation from space at all times. And they did this study where they shielded organisms into a lead box, didn't allow any radiation in, and they found that there were problems with that. So here I am thinking, you always think that radiation is this dangerous thing. And I have to tell you, even with the explanation, soaking in a radioactive bath, which is basically what it was, felt a little bit unusual to me. But nonetheless, when in Rome. So I was able to enjoy both the radioactive water and all the other mineral waters, and I've lived to tell the tale, of course. So actually, they have done these studies, controversial as they may be, because we have this ingrained concept that radiation is just terrible for you. But they have done these studies to show that very, very, very low doses of radiation can actually induce certain beneficial biological effects. And of course, the analogy to life is obvious. What doesn't kill us makes us stronger. That quote that we've all heard. And why is that? Because even in the macro global scale, whenever we are exposed to some sort of trauma or stress, and if we survive, we often have formed new adaptive responses to things that allow us to thrive and to grow as an individual. So not only is it happening on a micro level, but it's also happening on a macro level. And one concept which is interesting before we get into really the meat of tonight's class, which is really discussing dietary factors and factors in daily life that can allow you to utilize this concept of hormesis to improve your overall health. Well, when you get to understand that, but before that, we want to discuss one thing, which is that one hormetic stressor, one stress in particular, is something that can protect against different stressors. In other words, using the macro analogy, it may be that, you have, you survive a trauma of some sort, but ultimately you learn to deal with life in many different ways as a result of that adaptive response. Well, the same thing happens on a micro level, in the sense that one adaptive response, in other words, your biology, coming up to be able to deal with this response, to deal with this toxin, actually provides benefits to other aspects of things. And so one of the concepts that I hope to impart to you tonight is to think of this as something that is going to affect multiple things. As I spoke to you about briefly, when it comes to exercise doesn't just improve your muscles and your cardiovascular system, but there are benefits to the gut, believe it or not. There are benefits to the nerves that aren't necessarily intuitive to the concept of exercise. And therefore, by being able to do this, be able to do exercise and incorporate these stressors into your life, these beneficial stressors, you have to, you can develop this incredible appreciation for the fact that you're improving yourself in probably more ways than we even know at this point in time. So let's jump into the dietary factors, and you'll see that we're encountering ideas that we've spoken about many times over the course of these 79 weeks that we've been together. And it's one of those things that I just find to be miraculous about trying to come to a really holistic view of of human health. And that is that when you look at things through different lenses, whether it's the lens of heart health or skin health, whether you look at it on a micro level, in this case, we're looking at it from the concept of this thing called hormesis, this beneficial biological stress, you start to see patterns and ideas that continue to recur. And what you're going to see now is some of those things. So what increases the risk for chronic diseases? And of course, we're narrowing the focus here, and that is ultimately excess calories. For all you want to say about, saturated fats and excess sugar and a whole host of things, when it comes to really looking at all the data, excess calories are really going to be most associated with increasing the risk for chronic diseases. And if we simplify what decreases the risk, there's hundreds of studies, as you know, that they come out every day, and it just seems as though one day it says one thing, one day it says the other. But ultimately, some form of energy restriction, some form of calorie restriction has been shown to consistently, on a scientifically written up basis, decrease the general risk for chronic disease. And of course, we've spoken about this at length. There are many ways of doing some form of calorie restriction. There is intermittent fasting. Of course, we've spoken about that quite a bit. And there's calorie restriction. There are people who, because they want to live a long time, go through calorie restriction. The point really here is that there are periods of time where calorie restriction can be incredibly beneficial. And you get a general deeper understanding of that through understanding it through this particular lens that we're talking about tonight. So biological fasting, we've spoken about before, otherwise known as the fasting mimicking diet. This is a 5-day reduced calorie diet that's vegan, and it's vegan because you don't want to activate certain sensors that, in other words, this is a 5-day program that mimics the effect of a fast, but still allowing you to eat. I've spoken about that quite a bit. And one of the things that gets activated is this concept called autophagy. And now autophagy is this concept where your body is basically recycling old parts of the cell. And this happens during calorie restriction, happens during the biological fasting program. And believe it or not, there are also agents called calorie restriction mimetics, or in other words, food-based, nutrient-based chemicals that are going to cause a similar effect to calorie restriction. So that I'm mentioning that today only because you're going to be seeing these in the news a lot. Of course, many of you have heard of resveratrol, which is found in red wine, but there's also something called sirtuin activators. You're going to see these in the news. I mentioned them, but it's not important for you to remember them. The point being that your body is capable, through calorie restriction, which is a stressor, of course, to be able to cause a phenomenon where your body, the cells, start to recycle, in the sense that the old machinery in your cells gets actually taken out, eaten up, and then replaced by new machinery. And therefore, in essence, that particular cell has become younger. How? As a response to the stress of calorie restriction. Now, of course, you can calorie restrict too much and cause the opposite, in the sense of, you can wither away and die. The point here is learning how to incorporate these strategies in proper ways. Of course, for me, I always recommend biological fasting, or fasting mimicking diet, through its many different ways. But specifically that 5-day reduced calorie diet that was popularized by Dr. Walter Longo, because it's 5 days, everyone can do it, and you get really profound benefits. But the point being here is that it is a stress. I mean, going on a reduced calorie vegan diet for 5 days is a stress to the body. But what happens in response to that, the adaptive response, and that's why this is a stressor that is beneficial, is profound, from autophagy to growth hormone release to a whole host of things that improve all kinds of factors that are related to longevity. Now, this dietary restriction, calorie restriction that we've spoken about, also increases the resistance of cells to various stressors. Now, in the lab, in animals, you could see this in the sense of various different studies that show in certain animals reduction in cancer, reduction in the increased toxin resilience. In other words, you after doing this, you have to expose the animals to a higher level of toxins to be able to have an effect. We're talking about what the result is when you calorie restrict animals and insects and such. And same thing from ischemic injury. In other words, blocking off blood flow. There's resilience to that when animals are in the lab are subjected to this. So how does it work? I'm not going to spend a lot of detail here because it's quite complicated, but I mention it because I know some of you, especially looking at the list of people on the call today, I know some of you are body hackers and into understanding all the science. But essentially what's happening is there is all kinds of upregulation of various things. Heat shock proteins, which you can get also heat, sauna is another way of incorporating that. Upregulation of antioxidant mechanisms. So things that, for example, in your liver is capable of increasing the amount of antioxidants as a result of going through some form of intermittent fasting or calorie restriction. Your mitochondria start to improve. And even in the brain, there's all kinds of effects that can happen. And also you get decreased levels of insulin and IGF-1. Now, many of you who have been with me for most of the time that we've been doing these classes know that, especially with IGF-1 and insulin, if you get these down, many of you know I am a big fan of checking insulin levels to really see what's going as an indicator of overall health. One of the indicators of overall health and IGF-1, both of these. And when you can decrease these, there are so many beneficial positive effects to your overall health. So that's basically how it's working on a biological level. But honestly, for the average person, really all you need to know, of course, is that the data is unequivocal when it comes to incorporating some form of calorie restriction. Again, I'm a big fan of Dr. Walter Longo, who basically suggests doing a 5-day low fasting mimicking diet once a month for 3 months, and then every quarter of the year, essentially. And that's what I do. That's what I recommend to all my patients if I can convince them to do it. There are many ways of easily incorporating this into your diet, but ultimately, some people like to do intermittent fasting or or time restricted feeding where, they don't eat for 12 or 16 hours a day. All of these types of periodic stressors like this are going to be incredibly beneficial. And basically they work through, really changing the way things are going on in the body through this is just some of the things that we know. There's going to be more as we learn more, as science progresses, about how these things work. But the fact that they work is pretty undeniable. And I think that it's critical for people to incorporate that into their overall diet strategy in some way. So now let's talk about dietary phytochemicals, dietary phytonutrients. In other words, those things that we always thought we know about, that, if we eat broccoli and fruits and vegetables, it's all those pigments and antioxidants, and they are basically, doing all this stuff in our, they're acting to knock out all the oxidants, acting as an antioxidant. Well, the truth of the matter is that when you do studies to try to raise the level to look at the antioxidant capacity of the body with eating fruits and vegetables, what you find is, believe it or not, there isn't that much improvement in the antioxidation capacity of the body by eating all these fruits and vegetables. Believe it or not, that was surprising to me. It's actually, but it's undeniable, of course, that fruits and vegetables are beneficial for you. That I believe is undeniable. Now, that introduces this concept of the biopesticide concept. Now, we've spoken actually a little bit about this before. But we haven't really labeled it as such, but you have to understand that vegetables, specifically vegetables here, a lot of the beneficial things that are happening in that vegetable are produced by the vegetable to ward off insects. And so therefore they are some of the most amazing chemicals in these vegetables are actually a result of the plant trying to ward off insects. And when we eat them, these small doses of these biopesticides, which are things you've all heard of, most likely, like curcumin from turmeric, resveratrol we've spoken about before, which is found, in grapes, isothiocyanates, which are found in cruciferous vegetables like broccoli. These things that make the broccoli a little bit bitter, if you bite into it when it's raw, those are there to ward off insects. And when we eat them, of course, it's not going to ward us off. In fact, it's providing us a low dose of a toxin. In other words, a toxin that was meant to ward off insects. And as a result of that, it's providing us with incredible benefit. Now, can you get a too high dose of broccoli? Well, if you say blended, I don't know why you would do such a thing, but if you blended, say, raw broccoli, you actually need to crunch the broccoli to get these chemicals released, which is another amazing thing that I just consider so fascinating, in that you don't get these chemicals formed unless there's a crunch. In other words, unless an insect has come by and started munching on the broccoli or any of the cruciferous vegetables, you don't get the combination of chemicals that create this toxin. So when we chew into it we crush the cell wall, it's like we cause this chemical reaction that releases this thing that's supposed to ward off the insects. But for us, it's providing a very, very low dose of a toxin that allows us to have all these beneficial effects. And with isothiocyanates, it actually upregulates all kinds of proteins, beneficial proteins. But remember, we spoke about how in the last section that one hormetic stressor can protect against different stressors. So there's other things that are going on with each of these examples of, say, isothiocyanates with cruciferous vegetables, curcumin with turmeric, resveratrol with grapes and wine. Grapes and wine activate some stress response pathways. In other words, it's almost as if it's like triggering a little bit, a tiny, tiny alert, and your body is responding in a beneficial way to be able to protect itself, but it doesn't necessarily need to. It's just activating things a little bit more. And again, these are just examples. It's undeniable that there are tens of thousands of chemicals in plants that we haven't even studied yet, some of which, probably a fair number of them, were developed by the plant to protect itself against various stressors. I mean, plants can't run away, so they have to develop all kinds of chemical defenses, whether it's a chemical defense against the sun or an insect, or oddly enough, fires. There are certain plants that regenerate inside of fire, all kinds of various types of things that are out there that the plant needs to be able to protect itself. And in a miraculous world, which I consider we live in, this really miraculous world where these incredible chemicals that were developed over eons of time to protect the plant against all the stressors of the sun and the wind and the insects and the animals, we eat them. And of course, we can develop benefits. Of course, there are toxic plants where, the levels, we're not dealing with hormetic doses of these low doses. Of course, there are plants that are incredibly toxic. And often in those particular plants, they evolve to protect themselves against big animals. Of course, those types of plants we can't eat. But for all the green vegetables and the cruciferous vegetables, we find this situation where the intention was to ward off low stressors that we can then ourselves eat and improve ourselves and improve the ability, the defenses in our body. So it used to be that these were thought of as antioxidants, but now we know better. We know better that there is a mild toxic effect that is causing us to activate all kinds of things, all kinds of genes that are protecting ourselves against things, and therefore we benefit. And to me, I think that is, a really interesting concept. So getting back to what I guess I didn't answer, which was the situation where can you overdose on broccoli, let's say? Well, for sure, if you blended raw broccoli in say into a blender. Again, I don't know why you would do such a thing. And you created a whole host of these. Not that you probably would just get sick. You probably just would feel nauseous. I mean, just the thought of having a raw broccoli smoothie makes me feel a little nauseous. But the point is that there would potentially be so much of these isothiocyanates that you probably would feel a little bit sick, but certainly not going to kill you like it might kill, say, an insect. Okay, before we go on, let me see if there are any questions. There is. Justin's asking, I do 16-hour fasting, 8-hour window of eating, intermittent fasting. It doesn't feel like a stressor. It's just my normal now. How can I test that it's working, is stressing the body in the right ways? So yeah, the point is that, Justin, is that you have adapted, and that adaptive response, regardless of whether it feels like a stressor or not, that adaptive response that it's happening. So therefore, you don't necessarily need to test or measure anything. Of course, I'm a big fan of testing insulin and IGF-1, and so you could certainly get those lab tests to see if the intermittent fasting is in fact doing something, especially if you have a history of those labs. But either way, it would be nice to know if those levels are are doing well because of the time restricted feeding that you're doing. So again, when you do the 5-day fast that I recommend, the fasting mimicking diet, biological fasting, the first time you do it, it may feel a little bit uncomfortable. It's actually fairly easy, but the second time you do it, it's even easier because your body, from a metabolic perspective, is tolerating it better. So you can't symptomatically feel necessarily some of these adaptations or stressors. They are biological stress that you may or may not feel, Justin. So the fact that you're doing that is fabulous, and probably the best way would be to get a lab test and see how things are going for you. Okay, I like this. We've spoken about oxidation. Everyone's heard of reactive oxygen species. And there was this diagram from one of the articles that I spoke about that I showed you at the beginning. And it's showing sort of the two hands of basically living in this world, reactive oxidative stress. And on the one hand, when you have oxidation, it directly damages protein, DNA, and lipids. I mean, it's a consequence of living life and breathing oxygen and eating food. But at the same time, your body has evolved an incredible set of adaptive responses. And we've spoken about these already. I just like the diagram that we have the heat shock protein, cell cycle regulation, autophagy, which we spoke about, selective apoptosis, where it can cause specific cells to die, all that we want. So all these adaptive responses are happening. And the miraculous thing about biology and a miraculous thing about life is such that these adaptive responses are affecting things beyond just protecting against oxidative damage. Because, if we have autophagy stimulation, that has potential to improve your longevity. If it's heat shock proteins have a whole host of other benefits. So we always have to remember that we shouldn't assume that we have some general idea or specific idea what's happening, because it's often so many other things that are happening as well. Okay, so we're moving right along, and we'll probably end in the next 10, 15 minutes. And let's talk a little bit about daily life. So we've spoken about, of course, to review, general idea that low doses of many types of toxins are going to lead to a beneficial effect. You can almost think of it as overcompensation. In other words, small toxin, and you get this amazing response, and it's almost like it overcompensates and spills out and affects other things in a beneficial way. And we spoke about dietary factors. Probably the most important two concepts to remember from what I just spoke about are some form of making sure you're not eating too many calories. Second probably is, of course, that if you have some form of incorporating some kind of periodic calorie restriction, then you're going to see additional benefits. And again, it's overcompensation, spilling over into other factors. This can be mimicked by certain phytochemicals, like we spoke about, and there are many. And of course, all the leafy green vegetables, all the vegetables that are out there that we all know are supposed to be healthy for you, are working in so many other ways than we actually thought they were. They're not necessarily working as bland antioxidants. They're working as mild stressors that are going to, again, get overcompensated, spilling over into affecting a whole host of other things like autophagy and all kinds of other longevity factors, activating genes that are beneficial for overall health. So all those things, it's incredible thing that's happening. So let's now jump into dietary daily life. What can we think about in terms of daily life? Well, look, we've spoken about exercise many times. And I've also even told you in the beginning of tonight's class that the benefits are not just cardiovascular and musculoskeletal, but also all kinds of benefits in the nervous system and the digestive system, again, spilling over into a whole host of other things. And so this particular, we generally don't, it's almost like we just take for granted that exercise is good for us, but it's nice to ask yourself the question, well, I mean, why is it good for us? And it's good for us because it's stressing the body to adapt. If we sit all day and we're not activating our muscles and exercising, then that adaptive response is not happening, but also you're going to wither away. But the overall benefits are happening because of an adaptive response. Now you can overdo it, and over exercising is a huge problem, I believe. Especially, look, I practice in Southern California, now I practice in Southern Florida, and there are a ton of people who I see who over-exercise. And, it's hard to know whether you are over-exercising. There's no question, things like CrossFit. CrossFit doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be over-exercising, but certainly I've had patients who are in CrossFit who are incredibly fit. They look fabulous, but unfortunately, they are also probably, many of them, are over-exercising. What can over-exercising do? What can too much stress, too much exercise do? Well, it can lower your immune system, and it can make you a lot more susceptible to infections. And among colleagues of mine who have been seeing patients with COVID, there are, I have heard, just amongst the lifestyle medicine forums that I'm in, that there have been many COVID complications in people who otherwise were incredibly fit. And one of the things that many of us think is that some of them were over-exercising to a point that it was affecting their immune system. Now, there's really no good way to know whether you're over-exercising. For most of us, for the majority of the population, people need to exercise more. There's no question about that. But for people who are over-exercising, some people use something called heart rate variability. We spoke about that before as an indicator of how stressed you're. In other words, the balance of your nervous system is. That's one way of doing it. If you're getting colds, minor infections on a semi-frequent basis, and you're overall healthy but very, very fit, it could be an indicator that you're exercising too much. So it's just something to be aware of. So again, certainly something I see practicing in South Florida as well as Southern California, where there are obviously various kinds of fitness trends and people who are working to look as sexy as they possibly can be, and sometimes overdo it. Okay, diet as we discussed, and again, the one thing that has been well established is maintaining, making sure you're not getting excess calories is probably the best way to do it, and then periodically doing some sort of calorie restriction. And intellectual activity. We don't necessarily think about intellectual activity, but as a stressor. But in fact, if you look at it from a biological perspective, in fact, it is a stressor. Your brain has to adapt to intense intellectual exercise. And of course, just like exercise, it adapts in such a way that you become smarter, believe it or not, and you preserve your intellectual ability. Of course, many of you probably have heard of the study that showed that people who do New York Times crossword puzzles into their older age preserve their intellectual function much, much more than people who do not do that, the New York Times crossword puzzle. Certainly in my tradition, there is something called the Talmud, where that is an incredibly intense intellectual exercise that is definitely like exercise for your brain. Anyway, every tradition has these sorts of things where intellectual activity amongst the almost expected amongst sort of the elders of society. Anyway, what's happening there? From a biological perspective, there's all kinds of things happening with calcium channels and influx of ions, and there's some, believe it or not, free radical production that happens with intense exercise, which means there's also aerobic stress. In other words, it's like your neurons are exercising, which means that we have to remember that just like you can overdo this type of exercise, you can overdo intellectual activity. On the same thinking, you also need downtime. And that's why, of course, things like prayer and meditation have always been, at least in my tradition, it's supposed to be a balance. You're supposed to have this period of time where you go into downtime, where you go into a prayer meditative state. And this is going to balance out and allow your neurons to repair themselves. Ultimately, however, sleep is by far the time that your brain just cleans itself out and is able to adapt and grow. So if you are working hard, I have an incredible lots of intellectual activity, unfortunately, and you're not sleeping well, unfortunately, that's going to be not good for your brain. And so therefore, you should just be conscious of that. In addition, you always need to realize that every culture prescribes some form of specifically, morning rituals that are, or at least periods of downtime during the day that are going to allow your nervous system to calm down. And when you balance out your nervous system, your brain calms down, and all these things put together allows your brain and your nervous system to sort of work itself into a balanced reparative state. Conventional treatment and alternative treatments, medicines, just the medicines like the pills that you get prescribed by your doctor, believe it or not, have more than their specific effect. In other words, a lot of the medicines that we see today, and as they get better and better, are focused on like one very specific target, one receptor on one particular cell, and as science progresses, it becomes a lot more targeted. But believe it or not, many of the medicines we have, especially those that were derived from plants, and I believe it's something like 40% of the pharmaceuticals we have are derived from plants, there is also things happening that are off target. In other words, it may be targeting like that one particular receptor, but believe it or not, there are other off-target spillover effects in the sense that maybe something is going on that's like hormesis, that this is a little bit of a toxin, and your body is responding in other ways. Just something I thought that was interesting. Acupuncture may also, certainly it releases some endorphins that can make you feel very good. And that's certainly a response to the stress of having needles inserted. But ultimately, of course, there's all kinds of traditional Chinese medicine theories about how acupuncture works beyond that, of course. We've spoken about sauna and hot baths. So many cultures around the world have this tradition of sauna and hot baths. And I certainly recommend for so many people who don't have that downtime to try to incorporate hot baths, because it's just so relaxing. And most of us are capable of most of us are blessed to be able to have a bathtub at home and to be able to luxuriate and really take the time for yourself to lie in a bath, maybe light a candle. I spoke about how certain scents in the past activate the cannabinoid system, that's related to relaxation, like lavender, things like that. So you can incorporate these into the bath to make it extra relaxing, to balance out your nervous system. I just highly recommend that. Of course, sauna, again, has been incorporated into so many things, so many cultures, but we all can have hot baths for the most part. Believe it or not, the extreme of a cold bath can also be beneficial. However, I must say that amongst people, and some of them patients, I've had people that I truly believe started to get more like simple infection, simple colds and small viruses as a result of trying to incorporate cold baths. So if you do that, again, it's completely anecdotal. I haven't done a study or anything of the sort, but I would say, cold baths are becoming very trendy amongst billionaires, and not just billionaires, but people who are, body hackers and such. And they have now, you can buy, not so, reasonably priced baths that will cool the water down so that people can do that. Again, another type of stressor. I would just recommend that unless you really know that you have balanced out your nervous system, that you get enough rest and relaxation, I would rather you do a hot bath than incorporate cold baths. Different benefits to each one. That would require a whole other lecture, but just something to keep in mind. And finally, ultimately, you're needing to find the right dose for you. So all we've spoken about today is all these different stressors, from exercise to diet, to restricting calories, to intellectual activity, to sauna and baths, and giving you a general idea of really what is going on in your body, and how understanding that gives you a better appreciation of how your body functions. I mean, when we realize, in fact, that these types of beneficial stressors and your body is capable of responding in such a way, again, that spills over into so many other parts of your body, it just really, to me, is awe-inspiring that happens. And it gives me a better appreciation of the body, and it gives me a better appreciation of taking care of ourselves and our health and the health of our loved ones and such, because of the fact that we are in possession of this just unbelievable, miraculous human body that is so resilient in so many ways. So anyway, that is my class on hormesis, beneficial stressors. I hope you really enjoyed it. Next week, we're going to be discussing, and that'll be episode 80, amazingly. We're going to be discussing, and if anyone has any questions, do let me know. Thank you, Justin, for yours. Next week, we're going to be discussing, what do animal studies show about food and longevity? The point is the point of next week is really that it's so difficult to do nutrition studies in humans. I mean, you can't put them in a cage and feed them a certain thing and watch them over a lifetime because it takes too long. So what can we learn from all of the insect and animal studies that can allow us to get a better appreciation of what does the science show about diet and longevity and diet and health from animals? Because look, you can understand that better. You can look at it because the lifespans are shorter. And you can do those studies and determine, what's the proper protein level? What's, all these controversies. Some of them I truly believe have been answered in animals. Of course, you can't necessarily generalize that to humans. The point is that it gives us a general guideline and understanding when we have an idea. If it's duplicating in all these different insects and animals, then there is something applicable to humans. And next week we'll do a summary of what those studies show generally about diet, lifestyle, and longevity, or mostly diet and longevity when it comes to the science we have with animals. So thank you everyone for attending tonight's class. I do appreciate it. And as you know, I love doing this. If you have any sort of questions or whatever, feel free to reach out. You know how to reach out. And I wish everyone a good night and good health. Good night.